Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction. Today we are watching the third part of Epic History TV's Napoleonic Wars series. Today we are covering the Battle of Jena. So without further ado, let's go.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. In December 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, won a crushing victory against the joint forces of Austria and Russia. Napoleon now dominated Europe, able to hand out spoils as he saw fit. In February 1806, he sent an army led by Marshal Massena to overthrow the King of Naples, who had dared to side with his enemies, and gave his throne to his own brother Joseph instead.
Yes, this was a classic Napoleon move. He would go into these kingdoms, previously independent kingdoms, put it under military occupation, then he would install a French puppet government, and eventually he would install his own siblings on these thrones around Europe. And of course, the purpose was to establish a European dynasty, create legitimacy for the House of Bonaparte as an imperial house. And that's exactly what he did, virtually everywhere in Europe.
Another brother, Louis, was made King of Holland.
Yes, and let's take this moment to briefly talk about the House of Bonaparte. Of course, we have Napoleon, he is the Emperor of the French, and the King of Italy, really northern Italy. And then we have Joseph, who was the King of Naples initially, but later he became the King of Spain. He had a pretty close relationship with Napoleon. He is the eldest brother, so he's older than Napoleon. And we have Louis here, who became the King of Holland. Now Louis, he was interesting. When he became King of Holland, he actually learned Dutch, and he began pretty impressive efforts to modernize the country. He was very popular among the Dutch populace. However, he did not run Holland according to Napoleon's instructions. He had an independent streak. Now, here's the thing with Napoleon. He likes to micromanage, so he did not allow his client states and brothers and sisters who were ruling on various thrones to rule independently. They were supposed to do what Napoleon wanted them to do. And so Louis was quickly deposed after a few years, and he went to live out exile in Italy. He is the father of the future emperor Napoleon III. So there's that. Who else do we have? We have Lucien Bonaparte, one of the forgotten brothers. Now, he participated in the coup of 18 Brumaire and helped Napoleon get to power. However, when he announced his intentions to declare himself emperor and establish an imperial house, Lucien, who was a fierce republican, he vehemently disagreed, and he fell out with his brother. So he went into self-imposed exile in Rome, and eventually they were reconciled, but only in 1815 during the 100 Days. There's also Jerome, who will show up later. He is going to become the King of Westphalia, a German kingdom. Jerome is widely regarded as the most unsuccessful of Napoleon's brothers. He was overall a pretty poor political leader, and he was a disastrous general, as later events would prove. Actually, when he ran the Kingdom of Westphalia, he had expenses for his court that rivaled Napoleon's own, and of course Napoleon was famously very sparse with his court, and he did not like to spend money on frivolous things. Yes, those were the brothers. There was also a few sisters. Eliza Bonaparte is probably the most, anonymous figure. She was the only of Napoleon's sister to wield political power. She was pretty headstrong and pretty similar to Napoleon in terms of personality. She was appointed Princess of Lucca and Piombino and the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, so she controlled a lot of land in Italy. Now, during her political rule there, she promoted and encouraged the arts. That's what she's most famous for. Then there's Pauline. Pauline is the younger sister. Had a pretty close relationship with Napoleon. Was initially married to Napoleon's general, General Leclerc, but he died in Haiti during that expedition. And so she married an Italian noble, became an Italian princess by marriage. Then there's Caroline. Caroline is the youngest sister, and she married Napoleon's marshal, Marshal Murat, later became the Queen of Naples. And during her tenure as queen, she promoted both the arts and the excavations at Pompeii. An interesting tidbit right there. Okay, that was a quick rundown of the Napoleonic family at this time.
His German allies, Bavaria and Württemberg, were elevated to the status of kingdoms, while Napoleon made himself protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, a new alliance of German states that would contribute 60,000 troops to his army.
Yes, the Confederation of the Rhine is basically a confederation, like it says, of French-German client states. This confederation is going to become bigger than it's seen on the map right here. And at its peak, it will have 15 million subjects. And this was a great strategic and advantageous buffer for France against Prussia and Austria. And it was also a great source of reliable manpower in all of Napoleon's future campaigns from this point onwards. The Germans are very good troops, unlike many of the other troops that came from other French client states.
In recognition of the new reality, Emperor Francis of Austria formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne 1,000 years before, but now without influence or purpose.
Yes, the Holy Roman Empire. Now, if there's one thing you know about the Holy Roman Empire, or you should know about the Holy Roman Empire, is Voltaire's famous quote that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. And this is very much true. Holy, not really, since the Holy Roman Emperors often clashed with the Pope over who was the supreme head of, supreme figure, so to speak. Roman, it has no connection to Rome at all, so that's just made up, basically. Nor was it an empire. It was not a centralized state of any kind. It was more of a political institution which had member states in it. So it was like a United Nations of Germany, sort of. So the emperor did not have any great centralized authority over the empire. Of course, and it was the Habsburg family who were the emperors of the HRE, which meant was the Emperor of Austria. So, ever since the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, the empire has really ceased to be a useful political institution. However, it was still reliable for military, defensive purposes, primarily. But the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine meant that several German states seceded from the empire, and at that point, the empire just died. It was also partly dissolved, not only because it had become useless, but also Francis I wanted to prevent Napoleon from possibly claiming the title of Holy Roman Emperor, though I'm not sure Napoleon would have went for that anyways, but yeah. And I also do not agree with this founding date. I do not agree that the Holy Roman Empire was founded in the year 800. I would say it was founded around 962 with the accession of Otto I. But that's just my 2 cents about that particular bit.
Austria had been humiliated. France remained at war with Britain, Sweden and Russia. But in the summer of 1806, all eyes were on Prussia.
Napoleon is a monster who has emerged from the mire. Queen Louise of Prussia.
The Prussian king, Frederick William III, regarded Napoleon with deep mistrust and had been about to join the coalition against him when news arrived of its disastrous defeat at Austerlitz. He was heavily influenced by his wife, the celebrated and popular Queen Louise, who detested France and Napoleon.
Yes, Queen Louise was described by Napoleon as the only man in Prussia, which is a sign of he, like many others around him, regarded the Prussian king Frederick William III as a very weak character. He's a very indecisive ruler, and that lands him in a lot of trouble. What Napoleon wants to hint at with that quote is that Queen Louise was actually running things. Now, it wasn't that bad, but she was a very powerful and influential advisor, and she successfully pressed for the war against France. She detested France and Napoleon, like they said. She was, in Prussia, a very extremely popular figure. Why? Well, she was seen as a perfect role model, basically, the embodiment of all good virtues out there. But we'll get back to Queen Louise in the next episode. Suffice it to say, she's almost can be considered a minister of the crown at this point.
She led the influential War Party at the Prussian court. Matters came to a head over Hanover, a German state which had belonged to British King George III, been occupied by the French, and given by Napoleon to Prussia as compensation for other territorial changes.
Yes, the Treaty or Convention of Schönbrunn 1805 was basically a friendship treaty between France and Prussia. The treaty was very simple. Prussia was allowed to annex Hanover from France, which had occupied it from the British. And in exchange, Prussia will cede the territories of Ansbach, which was given to Bavaria, the Duchy of Cleves, which was given to Marshal Murat, and the Principality of Neuchâtel, which was given to Marshal Berthier. So yeah, it's a simple exchange of territories, and it was a great deal for Prussia because this meant that they could finally connect their very fragmented parts of Prussia. You can see these parts over here, and is not connected really to the main Prussian lands. But Hanover allowed them to make that connection and form some sort of cohesive territory. And that was an aim of Prussian policymakers for a very long time, and would continue to be so even after the Napoleonic Wars.
Now the Prussians learned that Napoleon had secretly offered to give Hanover back to Britain in exchange for
The
peace.
British were not happy about this, by the way.
Frederick's advisors now persuaded him that war was the only honourable course. But Prussia then made a basic strategic blunder, sending an ultimatum to Napoleon without consulting its new allies in the Fourth Coalition.
Yes, and you might wonder why. Well, my personal theory is that Prussia had a very self-inflated image of itself at this point, especially after emerging triumphant after the 7 Years' War. They believed in their own Prussian military superiority, would be able to handle any foe that could be thrown against them. This also shows that they had badly underestimated Napoleon and the French. And yeah, it is, like they said, a basic strategic blunder not to inform your supposed allies of this beforehand.
Their forces were too far away to help Prussia, who would now face Napoleon's Grande Armée with just the small state of Saxony for support.
And behind the fine facade, all was mildewed. Karl von Clausewitz. Now, Clausewitz, if you don't know, is one of the most famous military theorists of this century. Very influential, still very influential. His work is read on military academies to this day. Now, what he meant by this is that basically the Prussian army at this point was hopelessly outdated in every sense of the word. Tactics, drills, logistics, weapons, and organization. Now, don't get me wrong. It wasn't like the soldiers were bad. In fact, the infantry was very well disciplined, but they had been drilled to be quite inflexible, not up to speed to the Napoleonic style of war at all. And of course, the cavalry was very good, bold and brave, but it's outdated in what role it played in the Prussian army and its organization too. And they also had a large artillery arm, which was very good for the Napoleonic era, of course, but it was misemployed often. So the problem basically is that the Prussian army is stuck in the last century, where Frederick the Great used the Prussian army to and its superiority in every way back then to defeat all of his enemies. So they had not really changed too much since those days, and that was at this point more than 50 years ago. So yeah, they're outdated, and they will learn that lesson very, very hard during this war.
In 1806, the Prussian army had a fearsome reputation that dated back 50 years to the reign of Frederick the Great. Napoleon, a student of history, regarded it with respect. But Prussia's army had been allowed to rest on its laurels. Its generals were old, its staff work hindered by bureaucracy and personal rivalries, its movements ponderous and predictable. Prussian soldiers, however, could be relied on to fight with pride and determination, while Prussian cavalry was regarded as amongst the best in Europe. In October 1806, Napoleon invaded Saxony with an army of 166,000 men and 256 guns. Advancing in 3 columns, the French crossed the mountain forests of the...
Yeah, that's actually overall a bit smaller than the 200,000 around that size he had at disposal for the 1805 campaigns. Of course, large parts of that army were detached, so, only maybe half, not even that, were present at Austerlitz later on. But the overall army was larger. So it's a bit smaller, but, it's Prussia. He's not fighting multiple coalitions at this. Well, technically he's fighting a coalition, but there's only really one enemy in this campaign, and that's Prussia.
Thuringerwald, along roads carefully reconnoitered by scouts and spies. Napoleon intended to threaten Leipzig and force a decisive battle with the Prussian army, which he believed was near Gera. The Prussians were, in fact, further west, concentrating near Erfurt, on the west bank of the river Saale. Its commander, the Duke of Brunswick, had hoped to threaten the flank of Napoleon's advance. But wrong-footed by the speed of the French, he now ordered a retreat north to find a new defensive line. On the 10th of October, at Saalfeld, Marshal Lannes' 5 Corps clashed with a Prussian advance guard, commanded by Prince Louis Frederick, the king's cousin.
Yeah, the narrator got the name wrong. It was actually Prince Louis Ferdinand. But yeah, that's just a minor detail.
The Prussian force was routed, and Prince Louis himself killed in combat with a quartermaster of the French 10th Hussars. 3 days later, Lannes made contact with a large Prussian force near Jena and sent news to Napoleon. The French Emperor, believing he'd found the main Prussian army, rapidly issued orders for his corps to concentrate for battle at Jena. Bernadotte's 1 corps and Davout's 3 corps were to cross the Saale and fall on the Prussian flank from the north. But Napoleon was wrong. Lannes faced a 35,000-strong Prussian rearguard, commanded by General Hohenlohe. The main Prussian army, 52,000 men under the Duke of Brunswick, was further north, moving straight into the path of Davout's 3 corps.
In warfare there is but one favorable moment. The great art is to seize it.
The Battle of Jena began at 6:30 a.m. on the 14th of October, in thick fog. Marshal Lannes' 5 corps already had a toehold on the plateau west of the town and river. His first task was to drive back the Prussians and win room for the rest of the French army, arriving by the hour to deploy. His infantry led the way, and fierce fighting broke out for the villages of Cospeda, Closewitz, and Lützeroda. Meanwhile, Augereau's 7 corps advanced through a ravine, emerging onto the plateau on Lannes' left flank, while Soult's 4 corps climbed steep tracks to form on his right. Napoleon joined Lannes in the center of the battlefield, organizing a 25-gun battery to support the attack on Vierzehnheiligen.
Yes, this was a trademark Napoleonic tactic. He would assemble what is known as grand batteries. And a grand battery was basically a bunch of cannons in one place directed at one target. And in time, as these armies and campaigns would grow larger and ever larger, these grand batteries would become very, very big indeed. Sometimes over 100 cannons assembled to blast one front line. So yeah, this was trademark Napoleon, and he used it to great effect.
The village was won, but then lost to a determined Prussian counterattack. On the right, around 10 a.m., Soult's infantry secured Closewitz, but was counterattacked on its right flank near Rödigen. A decisive charge by Soult's light cavalry drove off the Prussians, routing their infantry and capturing 2 enemy colors. As 6 corps began to arrive on the plateau, its fearless but impetuous commander, Marshal Ney, ignored orders and dived into the fighting around Vierzehnheiligen.
Yes, this was typical of Marshal Ney. Marshal Ney likes to command from the front. He likes to be right there with the men. The problem is that this only works if Napoleon is supervising you. We will see later on, as Marshal Ney gets greater responsibilities commanding entire army corps, that, you know, how should I put this? When you are in a battle, right up there with your men, it is a great inspiration for them. They will fight harder and all that. But you lose control of the overall situation. You have no way of seeing the battlefield when you're right in it. And this is what happened to Marshal Ney in this case. His advance guard, it was not even his entire corps. He threw himself in there without waiting for the rest of his corps. And he was facing odds of 2-1. This paid off initially. They were kind of caught off guard, the Prussians, that is. But eventually this tactic led to heavy casualties. He was forced to form square to ward off cavalry attacks. And he was beyond the supporting range of Augereau's corps here and Lannes' corps. They were not in a position to support him at this time. Luckily for Ney, And Napoleon had already seen what was happening, so he sent up reinforcements to bail Ney out, basically. And, Napoleon was not very pleased at this.
Becoming briefly cut off by a Prussian counterattack and having to be rescued by Guard cavalry. General Hohenlohe was expecting the arrival of 15,000 more troops under General Ruchel at any moment. Until then, he remained largely inactive, shoring up his line and ordering limited counterattacks. But he had run out of time. Napoleon had begun the day with just 25,000 men. By 12:30, a steady stream of reinforcements had brought his strength up to 96,000.
Yes, and here we see the advantages with the corps system. A battle was engaged by a few corps in the beginning, but with some orders flung around to the various corps commanders, they could quickly concentrate for battle and overwhelm the enemy like this. Now, it should be said that the Prussians weren't quite this badly outnumbered. They were still outnumbered, but the ratio was more 2-1, because General Ruchel, which is coming up here, over here, adds to the numbers. So the Prussians had more, around 55,000 perhaps, but still very badly outnumbered. And more importantly, the French army was just leagues better at this point.
As the Emperor rode past the Imperial Guard, one young soldier, eager to be sent into action, called out, "Forward!" Napoleon stopped and demanded to know who had spoken, then rebuked the soldier as a beardless youth who ought not to offer advice until he too had commanded in 30 battles. But the moment had arrived. Although the Guard, to its frustration, remained in reserve.
This is very typical of Napoleon. He did not want to commit his guard to almost any battle, and he was almost a bit too conservative. I could understand why he'd want to preserve his elite veteran reserve units, but there were times, especially at Borodino, at Waterloo, where they could have made a great difference, could have decisively won the battle, but yeah, it's just, overall, I don't think if Napoleon had committed his guard more often, that would have changed the course of history or anything. But yeah, he was perhaps a bit too conservative.
The other French corps were ordered forward in a general attack. The Prussian army began to give ground. At first it kept its discipline, but then disintegrated into a general rout. Murat's cavalry were launched in pursuit, riding down and sabering hundreds of fleeing Prussians. General Ruchel's 2 divisions finally arrived at the worst possible moment. They briefly held up 5 corps' advance, but were soon outflanked, broken up by cannon fire, and charged down by French cuirassiers.
You Marshal must be seeing double.
Meanwhile, 12 miles to the north, near Auerstadt, Marshal Davout was marching southwest, expecting to fall on the Prussian left wing at Jena. Instead, he encountered the Duke of Brunswick's main Prussian army, heading north to take up new positions. Davout's 3 corps, 27,000 men and 48 guns, was about to face odds of 2-1. While Bernadotte's 1 corps, which had orders to support Davout, was nowhere to be seen. Davout, nicknamed the Iron Marshal, showed no signs of alarm. He formed his 1st Division into a defensive line centered on the village of Hassenhausen, his infantry forming squares to repel a series of cavalry charges by General Blücher's advance guard. His other 2 infantry divisions arrived to strengthen the line, standing firm in the face of repeated Prussian attacks. But Prussian movements were slow and poorly coordinated. Nor did they use their numerical advantage to try and outflank Davout. At a crucial moment, the Duke of Brunswick was shot through the eyes, a wound that proved fatal. King Frederick William himself took command.
Yes, while King Frederick William took command, maybe officially, he didn't really do that. It was very confusing after the Duke of Brunswick was lost. And Frederick William was not by any means a military man. He was not a great military leader. He was there to inspire the troops, basically. And so, yeah, things got really quite chaotic in the Prussian camps, and it just deteriorated an already bad situation they had put themselves in by not using the reserves to try to outflank Davout, like they mentioned, and all that.
Prussian units remained uncommitted, but the king, convinced he faced the main French army under Napoleon, dithered. Around 1215, Marshal Davout counterattacked. The Prussian army turned and fled.
An extremely impressive
Davout
victory.
had won a stunning victory against the odds, but at a heavy price. His corps suffered 25% casualties. 1 man in 4 killed or wounded, while inflicting twice as many losses on the Prussians.
Tell the Marshal that he and his generals and his troops have gained everlasting claims on my gratitude.
When news reached Napoleon that Marshal Davout had engaged and defeated the main Prussian army, he reacted first with disbelief, then heaped praise upon the Iron Marshal, later awarding him the title Duke of Auerstadt. Marshal Bernadotte, in contrast, was nearly court-martialed for failing to support Davout.
Yes, and here we get into one of the more hotly debated topics of the Napoleonic Wars, which is Marshal Bernadotte's conduct at Jena. Now, there's a lot of people out there that are vehemently anti-Bernadotte for reasons that will become very obvious soon enough. But, looking at it on a surface level, yeah, I can see how you would make a case that Bernadotte abandoned Davout and sabotaged him. But when looking at it more deeply, I don't see that there is clear, conclusive evidence to set out that that Bernadotte deliberately sabotaged Davout, and by extension then sabotaging Napoleon. Yes, there are things during these events in the Jena campaign that Bernadotte deserves criticism for. However, this battle, one must keep in mind that this battle at Auerstedt would never have happened if Napoleon had not made a flawed assessment of the Prussian army's location and intentions. That is what led to the battle in the first place. Davout and Bernadotte was not supposed to encounter any resistance at all during this flanking maneuver at Jena. Yeah. Some blame must also be placed on Marshal Berthier, the Chief of Staff, because during this whole episode and many other episodes, while his system of bureaucracy of issuing orders worked well, for the most part, there are episodes where Berthier issues rather ambiguous and contradictory orders, and this was also the case here. When you look into it, it's very confusing, all the orders that are flying around, and so he would actually also need to take some of the blame. That's just my opinion. I know many other people have other opinions, and I certainly understand where they're coming from, but that's just my take. Of course, I'm biased, I'm a Swede. Bernadotte is one of our most celebrated kings here, but I do believe, like I said, there is not enough conclusive evidence to make this determination that Bernadotte intentionally sabotaged Davout although Davout would take it as such and would continue to hold a grudge against Bernadotte for the rest of his life.
Napoleon's army began a masterful pursuit of the beaten Prussians, giving them no time to regather their strength. 2 weeks after the twin battles of Jena-Auerstadt, Napoleon's troops, led by Davout's heroic III Corps, entered Berlin. The next day, General Hohenlohe surrendered at Prenzlau. At Lübeck, General Blücher and 20,000 Prussians were driven out of the city in heavy fighting and forced to surrender, while 25,000 Prussians besieged at Magdeburg surrendered to Marshal Ney. Prussia's army had been devastated by a Napoleonic blitzkrieg. In just 33 days, Prussia had lost 20,000 dead, 140,000 prisoners, 800 guns, and 250 standards.
These numbers, let me be clear, these numbers are absolutely brutal and devastating. An effective loss of 160,000 casualties in like a month of campaigning. 800 guns, 250 standards. I cannot overstate how bad this went for Prussia. And yeah, like I said, this was a very hard lesson for Prussia, and they would learn from it eventually. It would take time.
It was a humiliation that proud Prussians like General Blücher would neither forget nor forgive.
Yes, Blücher, we'll be hearing more about him in the future.
Unlike Saxony, King Frederick William refused to make peace with Napoleon. He continued to hold out in East Prussia, trusting in the approaching Russian armies to rescue his kingdom. Despite another glorious victory for Napoleon and the Grande Armée, the war was not won yet.
No, it was not. And we'll see how that goes in the next episode. With that said, if you have anything to add, please write a comment. If you like the video, press the like button. And of course, subscribe if you want more content like this. We will be continuing this series. It's an excellent series. And yeah, with that said, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.